Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Freeman Spogli Institute. My name is Mariano Florentino Cuellar. I'm the director of the Institute, and it's nice to see such a very enthusiastic and large crowd. Our mission at FSI is to engage Stanford in understanding and addressing international challenges around the world. Today, as part of that mission, we welcome to Stanford the International Monetary Fund's Managing Director, Christine Lagarde. And we credit ourselves for sparing her from yet another blizzard in Washington. We're also delighted to be partnering with the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And I'm delighted that SIEPR's director, John Chauvin, who's here, is joining us and hosting Christine Lagarde today. We're working to deepen our relationship here on campus and to address crucial issues like economic development in sub-Saharan Africa. Today we come together to continue Stanford's history of examining the evolving concerns of the 21st century, as we hear from the leader who is at the forefront of global economic policy. Christine Lagarde is now the 11th managing director of the IMF, the first woman to head the 188-country financial organization. No doubt the meetings are a little more unruly than typical faculty meetings, but probably not by much. Since she took over the IMF in 2011, she has been immersed in a series of challenges that have faced the world: a sluggish global economy, the debt crises in Europe and Greece. She's also focused on making the IMF more culturally diverse and has placed a premium on increasing women's participation in the labor force. She has been crucial in rounding up European support for Greece's economic bailout. And of course, what confirms any judgment about Managing Director Lagarde's good sense is that she is a lawyer. In fact, prior to her work in government, Christine Lagarde was the first female chairman of the world's second largest law firm, Baker & McKenzie, ascending to this role in 1999. 1999 was also when a Stanford graduate student, myself, was writing a doctoral dissertation with a chapter about the IMF. I confess I've been wanting to meet someone in Director Lagarde's position since I wrote that chapter 14 years ago, and did my best to get to a position where we could make this happen. So thank you for being here. I know from that experience and time in government since then that it's not uncommon for observers to describe jobs like Managing Director Lagarde's as nearly impossible. But if anything, the position entails at least 3 jobs, each with its own degrees of near impossibility: financial decision maker, global diplomat, and CEO of a vast public organization full of acronyms. At the intersection of all these 3 jobs is a lot of stress, no doubt, but also an opportunity to help the world manage transnational problems affecting vast segments of the global population. As an observer of Managing Director Lagarde and the organization she leads, I will add that she's carried out her role with aplomb, intelligence, and what some might describe as élan. Today, we'll hear her insights on innovation and global interconnections. These are 2 areas that play a pivotal role right here in Silicon Valley and at Stanford, and that have huge implications for the global economy. After Managing Director Lagarde speaks, my colleague John Chauvin will moderate the question and answer session. Please join me in welcoming Managing Director Lagarde.
Well, thank you very much, Tino, if I may call you that way. And I think you're going to have to kidnap us if you want to really spare us the blizzard in Washington, because it's announced for tomorrow, and we're only scheduled to stay with you for today. So good luck with that. But it's a great honor to be addressing your group this afternoon here in Stanford. So to all of you, good afternoon. I hope you don't miss too much of a lunch. But we'll try to give you some food for thought, and I'm sure your questions will certainly allow this achievement. Thank you very much to both of you, to you, John, to you, Tino, for organizing this event and for having our team participate in this and be with you on this occasion. What I thought I would do, and I hope it's okay, I thought I would give you a little bit of our view on the world economic scene. I would also try to give you a bit of feedback on the G20 that just took place in Sydney, which is where I was yesterday. I don't know what's going on here, but I suppose it's something that is... Okay, it's better. And then I will address the point that you made, the relationship between innovation, interconnectedness, how it impacts on the economies, and what solutions there are to what are clearly big challenges. So let me first of all tell you a little bit of what we think about the current economic situation, the World Economic Outlook as we call it, and as we publish it on a regular basis and update it regularly as lately as January. While unemployment is still too high, while public and private debts are still too high, while growth is still too low on a global basis, you might not feel it here in the Valley, but that's how it's perceived on a global basis. We certainly see some economic momentum in the works. Our forecast for the global economy in 2014 is 3.75, coming from 3% in 2013, and the forecast for 2015 is 4%. So there is an uptick in this global growth, most of which is attributable to the advanced economies. And it is certainly the case here in the United States. It is the case as well in Japan, for reasons that some of you might know of. And it is finally the case in the Eurozone as well. And I'm using those countries in that descending order because those are the numbers that they are showing. Ironically, the emerging markets that really kept the global economy going together with the developing countries, because let's not forget that in the last 5 years, they produced about 75% of global growth. Ironically, those emerging markets are weakening, with the economic cycles turning and growth slowing. For some of them, the rising tide came with choppy waves. Strong growth opened up some vulnerabilities, identified some bottlenecks that came into focus as growth began to slow. Now, there's a bit of a chicken and the egg situation here, because at the same time, because the US domestic economy was faring a lot better, the Fed started the process of dialing back this unconventional monetary policy that it had started back 3 years ago. And this mix of conditions, the tapering on the one hand, and those vulnerabilities and bottlenecks arising out of this slower growth, produced the conditions for some capital to flow out of a number of emerging markets, thereby generating market volatility and currency variations. That's the situation as we see it at the moment. And in these circumstances, what we at the IMF have recommended is that monetary policies should remain accommodative in many advanced economies, with gradual tapering occurring as the economies fare better. That countries should continue to bring their houses in order by taking appropriate policy actions, adopting credible policy frameworks, and implementing structural reforms. And that structural reform point applies very much across the board. And that communication among policymakers should improve. Those are pretty much the key recommendations, the 3 key recommendations that we're making. And having just returned from Sydney, arrived yesterday morning from that G20 meeting, I'm rather reassured that policymakers from those G20 countries understand the issues and understand what is needed. Now, I'm assuming that all of you know what the G20 is, but for those who might have forgotten, the G20 is this grouping of the 20 largest economies of the world that represent roughly 85% of the global economy. So they're far from being the entire global world, so to speak, but they represent a very, very sizable chunk of the global economy. Now, what have they been doing? Well, they have been instrumental in trying to resolve the financial crisis because they were elevated to leaders level from the... I am not moving. So it's not me. So what they've done, they've tried to fight the financial crisis, being, moved to leaders level in I think November 2008 is when they first had a leaders' summit of the G20. And it has remained ever since a key forum at which to address economic and financial issues. For example, the G20 members, and I'm borrowing here a little bit from the Australian agenda, because Australia, nearby place, is the chair of the G20 this year. They've agreed to complete core financial sector reforms in response to the crisis of 2008, and they've agreed to complete that before the end of 2014. So the Brisbane summit that you will hear about, which will take place in November, should actually seal completion of the financial reform cycle that has been decided back at the London summit in 2009. Hopefully making the financial sector safer and less likely to cause crisis. The G20 governments and central banks have also agreed, and that's important in the current context, they have agreed to clearly and consistently communicate their policy actions and to continue cooperating in monitoring the spillover effects. Spillover effects are the consequences of domestic monetary policy decisions taken in a particular place that have ripple effects in other places of the world. The discussions under Australian presidency also rightly focused on country-specific as well as collective effort to restore medium-term economic growth that, if they were fully implemented, and that's a big if, could raise the level of GDP by an extra 2% over the next 5 years, which would clearly create significant additional jobs. That's a new mission that was assigned to the G20 by the Australian presidency. If you look at the other ones, the financial sector reform, better communication amongst policymakers, and also the tax reform that is underway at the moment on a global basis to allow the automatic exchange of information, for instance, to make sure that tax havens are coming through, not as tax havens, but as allowing a level of transparency that allows scrutiny. Those were existing reforms. This one, which has the purpose at the domestic level as well as on a collective basis to raise the level of GDP, is a new project of the Australian presidency, and it was endorsed strongly by all members. So I come back from Sydney having the impression that policymakers really want to be on the right track. Now you'll say, the right track to where? And the right track to what growth? Is it going to be the right track to solid, sustainable and balanced growth? Or is it going to be the right track to growth that is fragile and even erratic? Well, of course, everybody would like the former over the latter. And I will add later on in my remarks an additional attribute of that growth, which is inclusive, but I'll explain that in a minute. So, to answer that question, I think we need to look at the patterns of economic activity in the years ahead, and especially the role of technology and innovation in driving forward. Now, typically, economists will tend to look at what has happened, and they will extrapolate in their models. They will try to work from that basis to anticipate what will happen. Well, I'd like to quote at this moment Isaac Asimov, who is a master of science fiction literature, who said, and I think it applies very well to those who do econometrics here, "No sensible decision can be made any longer without taking into account not only the world as it is, but the world as it will be." Now that's a tough call. So what I would like to do in that context is address 3 questions. One is, what does new technology mean for the economy, especially for jobs? Second, how does it relate to one of the scourges of our age, rising inequality? And third, what about some solutions that would encompass education through what I call the new multilateralism? Okay, stay with me. Question 1, what does technology mean for the economy? what are the impacts? Let's just focus on interlinkages in the first place between technology and the economy. Now, you are ideally situated to assume that innovation is pushing ahead at warp speed. You know this, you live it, you drive it. Well, you have to drive innovation because you don't drive cars anymore. That's because you bike. We're certainly living through one of the most exciting periods in human history at the moment. That's how it feels. We can feel the air hum with virtual activity, reality transform under our very eyes. Pace of change is so fast that even technology of 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, seems like prehistorical. Those of you who are students probably do not even remember a time when phones were not smart, when cameras actually contained film, when Kodak was a giant, when text meant school books, and when wireless referred to an old-fashioned radio. Well, this advance is centered on the rise of global digital network, the hyper-connected world, combined with the rise of genuine machine intelligence. And if the previous revolutions that took place essentially back in Europe in those days were about using machines for brawn, this is about using machines for brain. And since technology is powering a giant leap in global interconnectivity, these are connected brains. Just look at some of the trends. Today's smartphones are much more powerful than yesterday's supercomputers. We see cars, not here, cars driving themselves, printers making complicated three-dimensional parts, and robots doing the most complex tasks. I referred to science fiction, but it's rapidly becoming science fact, not fiction. And indeed, we may just even get started when it comes to the power and reach of machine intelligence. So we are facing a massive transformation of our economies, not just in the advanced economies, because I could have mentioned a few examples from what's happening in the developing world as well, through the use of mobile telephones, for instance, in order to better harvest, in order to better plan. Massive transformation at very, very fast speed. So what does this all mean for our livelihood, for our common economic future? It is easy to conjure up a bright future of dramatically higher living standards. Technology will contribute to growth. We will all benefit. Routine tasks will be outsourced to uncomplaining machines. But you know what? Back in the 30s, an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes actually was thinking about a future of leisure and abundance centered on a 15-hour week. But it's also feasible to imagine a future that is much more grim, more in line with the dystopian picture favored by so many science fiction writers. Certainly, we can see some worrying trends of that. For a start, the effects of new machine technology are not showing up in productivity statistics. At least, not yet. And productivity is by far the most important driver of long-term economic growth. Now, some say productivity from this kind of advanced technology is virtually impossible to track and measure. Some others say, don't worry, it's coming. We will see it in the numbers. We certainly need to keep an eye on this. And we at the IMF are keeping our eye on that. And we hope very much that at Princeton, in this particular institute, you will also be looking at that very carefully to understand what productivity is coming out, what productivity gains are to be had from investing in innovation and producing breakthrough technology. But one of the biggest worries, however, is how technological innovations are going to affect jobs. Put simply, will machines leave workers behind or not? You know, despite his optimistic vision, Keynes actually worried about the transitional problem of what he called technological unemployment. What happens when we economize on labor faster than we can find new jobs for laborers? It's always a risk during rapid changes. We saw it at work with agricultural workers. We saw it at work with industrial workers. We are now seeing it with seasoned workers who can't find themselves in this unfamiliar ocean. In terms of job creation, this means that we might need to sprint faster in the years ahead, and maybe a lot faster, if only because of the legacy of the crisis. The crisis has caused roughly 96 million jobs to be eliminated. Just the crisis. I'm quoting ILO numbers here. As it is at the moment, there are, according to ILO numbers, 202 million people unemployed and satisfying the ILO definitions of unemployed, somebody who is actively looking for a job. 202 million. If it was a country ranking, if all the unemployed people currently were to set up a country, it would be the 5th largest non-economy of the world, of which 75 are young people. Now, we cannot allow a lost generation of that magnitude around the world. So clearly, jobs has to be a preeminent priority in the years ahead. And the major test of the new technological era is simple. Can it actually provide decent livelihood for all people? This feeds into a broader concern. Technological advance generally creates a small cohort of big winners, leaving many others behind. And that brings me to my second topic, my second question, the relationship with rising inequality. Do I need to say it here in this institution? Yes, because numbers are quite staggering, actually. Income inequality is on the rise across the world, in all economies. According to Oxfam, almost half the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the population. And stunningly, the bottom half of the world's population owns the same amount as the richest 85 persons in the world. That's staggering. Do you want me to repeat it? Okay. The bottom half of the world's population, so we're talking 3 billion people here, owns the same as the richest 85 persons in the world. Now, here in the US, and you know, the IMF is not a radical activist, okay? But I'll try to explain to you why it's important to actually worry about these things. Here in the US, the share of income taken home by the top 1% more than doubled since the 80s, returning to where it was on the eve of the Great Depression. Since 2009, the richest 1% captured 95% of all income gains, with the bottom 90%, while the bottom 90% got poorer. Now, while this is happening, the International Labour Organization also tells us that labour's share of income has fallen over the past 2 decades in 26 out of 30 advanced economies that they measure. And all of that despite the fact that labour productivity has actually risen. So what is causing such convulsion in the distribution of income? There is probably not a single factor, although it seems quite clear that technology is one of the major factors. It can create huge rewards for the extraordinary visionaries at the top and huge anxieties for the ordinary workers at the bottom. Oversimplification, probably. But certainly those, and that will take me to my third topic, certainly those with the lowest skills are having the toughest time in today's economy. And that's where, John, I agree with you. In the US, the unemployment rate for people without a high school diploma is 3 times greater than for those with a bachelor degrees or higher. Indeed, over the past 2 decades, only those with college degrees have seen rising real wages. Others are simply giving up or dropping out of the labor forces altogether. And that's probably what explains, one of the reasons that explains the participation rate at the lowest in a generation at the moment. Now, I know that this concern resonates in this university, which was founded, to use the words of Jane Stanford, with a spirit of equality. And I would like to quote her at this point because I think it applies quite well. One of the goals of this university, as it was set up by them, was, and I quote, to resist the tendency to the stratification of society by keeping open an avenue whereby the deserving and exceptional may rise through their own efforts from the lowest to the highest stations in life. And this noble ethos has always served Stanford well, and it will continue to do so, and that spirit will certainly be needed. Now, why? Why? Because if not managed carefully, rising inequality and economic exclusion can have pernicious effects. It can undermine economic, social, and perhaps even political stability. It can tear the fabrics of society apart. We now have firm evidence, based partly on IMF research, that a severely skewed income distribution harms the pace and sustainability of growth over the long term. So that's why we need to worry about it, independently from all the basic fundamental human reasons why one would want to focus on that, because it's not good for solid, sustainable growth. We also know from our work at the IMF that careful design of tax and spending policies can help reduce inequality. I know there is a lot of controversies about whether redistribution is actually the appropriate tool or one of the appropriate tools to actually combat this issue. But improving access to health and education, putting in place effective and targeted social programs, for instance, and maybe making taxation a bit more progressive, are smart devices to actually deal with this issue. Those policies are not easy to implement. They're not easy to decide. They're not easy to communicate because they throw up winners and losers. The potential for conflict and discord requires courage and determination. But not doing it and pursuing on that same path inadvertently is probably a much bigger stake than trying to deal with it. So in the years ahead, it will no longer be enough to look simply at economic growth. Remember the right path to economic growth? What kind of growth? Solid, sustainable, and balanced. I would hasten to add, inclusive as well. And this story about the boats rising with the tide? Well, we have to make sure that the small boats rise with the big boats instead of risking being capsized by them. And that brings me to my third major point today. Taking a step back, how can we make this new economic age enhance rather than diminish our humanity? How can we make this amazing innovation advance the prospects of all people? Are we going to use the same model? Are we going to look at the past? Are we going to try to forecast trend on that basis? Or do we have to rejig the system and the model and think it through, question it? I'd like to quote Abraham Lincoln at this point. He said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. What would this new thinking and new acting look like? I have a son who is in another university, who is studying architecture, and he always tells me, whenever you don't know, Mom, think about a drawing. So when I do a speech, I always try to think of an arrow, which takes me into a direction. But for that new thinking and that new acting, I'm thinking of a bridge that takes us to a platform. And the bridge I have in mind is education. Not any education. Education that is attuned to the requirements of the advanced machine age. Putting it simply, we need education systems that are keeping pace with changing technology and the ever-evolving world at work. And I'm sure that there is a lot of thinking here in this university and in many other top-notch universities. But on a global basis, I don't think that there are enough policymakers, enough governments who think strategically along those lines. Fundamentally, we need to change what people learn, how people learn, when people learn, and why they learn. We need to get beyond the traditional model of students sitting in classrooms, following instructions, memorizing material. Computers can do that. 21st century educational system must focus on areas where humans can outclass computers. Now, I'm taking a huge risk here in sort of, prescribing what education should be about. This is your call, not mine. But I'm just venturing a few ideas here and there. And I really think that cognitive skills, interpersonal skills, fine motor skills, sophisticated coding skills, are areas that need focus, development, and educational support. We can think of creative jobs, caring jobs, jobs that entail great craftsmanship, imagination. And given the rate and pace of change, we need the ability to constantly adapt and change through lifelong learning. We had a debate earlier on this morning as to whether somebody who had not graduated from high school was just a lost cause for life. I contend that this lifelong learning that we must participate in, that we have to encourage and activate, can actually be not 100%, but is at least the beginning of a response to that challenge. And what it means is that public and private sectors must work together more closely. It means that institutions of education must think even harder about how to equip today's generation for tomorrow's world. Now, top-tier schools like Stanford have an especially important role to play here. And as you know well, Stanford's model of education was innovative from the very first day. Co-educational, although a little bit separate, right? This is the man's dining room. Non-denominational, always practical, focusing on the formation of les honnêtes hommes, to use a bit of one of my old compatriot prescription, to form and train cultured and useful citizens, un honnête homme. Stanford was ahead of its time back then, and I know that it will continue to be ahead of its time as we venture into the exciting periods ahead. At that juncture, I would like to actually thank Stanford for being part of that wonderful platform that you've allowed us to borrow with the IMF to actually convey through e-teaching and via e-learning some of our basic management courses in public finance management, for instance. This is a very recent initiative that we are partnering with. So yes, machines have replaced muscles. And yes, computers can maybe replace our intelligence. But there are things that, in my view, cannot be replaced. The capacity to be truly human, our creativity, our innovation, our passion. So education must be that bridge between the present and the future, the old and the new. But that bridge must be not to nowhere, as was the case in Arkansas, I think it was, right? But we must also build that platform, that enduring platform. And by that I mean a new way of thinking about the global economy, what I call the new multilateralism, where all stakeholders take joint responsibility, not just for what they do at home, not just for their domestic policies, but also for the global common good, breaking down the borders and barriers that are really relics of a bygone age. And this is really the only safe way to bend the new age to our will, to manage the complex channels of a hyper-connected world, to get to grips with global problems that are no longer amenable to only national solutions, simply because those problems are not national problems. They couldn't care about borders, they couldn't care about frontiers, they couldn't care about the national regulatory environment. They're cross-border, and they need cross-border solutions. Now, the good news is that there are already a few institutions that are institutions of multilateralism. Think about the IMF, think about the World Bank, think about the WTO and a few others, think about the UN, of course. But I know the IMF a bit better, so I'll talk about it for a second. The fund is essentially what? It's like an economic club of 188 members who all put in a little stake in the club. That's called their quota. And they commit to communicate data and information, share statistics, apply same principles and standards. They commit to open their books. That's the Article 4 surveillance. And they commit to help each other in case any of the members is in trouble. And to those who think that the IMF should be for the developing world, they should be operating in Africa, what are they doing in Europe? Well, you have to know that the first program that was ever put in place at the IMF was for my own country, in France, shortly after the Second World War, which was when the IMF was put in place. First program was France. And then you had Italy and a few others. And it's gone around the world, and it will continue to do so, because crises do not spare certain economies to only focus on others. So of all the programs we have in place at the moment, a majority of them are in Africa or in some of the developing Asian countries, less so. But if you look at the amount that is committed, the largest amount at the moment is committed to some of the European countries, which have gone through a lot of trouble. So the club is for all. It's not a club of the rich that gives to the poor. It's a club where each country has a stake and can draw in order to remedy the short-term financial struggle that it is under, in consideration for new policies, new remedies, sorting out of the economy, and of course in consideration for reimbursing the amount that has been borrowed. So going forward, this new multilateralism that I'm calling for has to build from the old one and adapt to a world that is more interconnected, more networked, but also more diffuse and more dispersed in terms of power and decision-making. The IMF was set up in 1944 in Bretton Woods. Two key economists, John Maynard Keynes, Treasurer White, and 42 of their colleagues got together and set up the club. 44 in those days, 188 today. That says a lot about the dispersion, about the size that it's gone to. But it means that the institution of the IMF must be brought fully up to date and must be made fully representative of the changing dynamics. So from 44 we moved to 188, but everything has to change by the same token. So the number of chairs, the allocation of chairs, the size of quota, the allocation amongst the players must adjust regularly to the changing environment. And it is clear that it should not be skewed to the benefit of one group versus others. We are working hard on that and we will continue to do so. Now, more than this, the new multilateralism is not just about 188 new members. It also encompasses a dense web of networks and coalitions that are now deeply embedded in the fabrics of global society. Think about the rise of cities, the size of certain cities relative to the size of certain states. Think about the power and the size and the leverage of multinational corporations. Think about the strength of civil society organizations. And that's where you circle back to technology. Because if it is on the basis of those networks that some of these new players are actually getting a voice and have to be heard and have to be listened to and have to be paid attention to. And that's what I call multilateralism as well. They have a global reach. We need to respond to that. So there will be many different types of actors on this new global stage, and the challenge is for them to work cohesively together to just write the great next act of this global destiny of ours. And let me conclude on this word of destiny by agreeing with futurist Eric Brinjolf. I always have trouble with his name, so if he hears me, he should forgive me. Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, you may have read their book. They wrote the Second Machine Age. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I've got no authorship nor sharing of anything, but it's really worth it. And they say in that book, technology is not destiny. We shape our destiny. So how do we shape this destiny? I will borrow now from Star Trek. How can we make the future look more like the harmonious, united federation of planets and less like the soul-destroying Borg collective? That will be a great test of our time. And I know that the Stanford community is interestingly linked to those developments that will shape our future. You will be doing it. Thank you.
So I'm John Chauvin, and I'm what Madame Lagarde referred to as a seasoned worker.
So am I.
But we have about 20 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to give her some questions, but each of you one question, a short question, and no mini speeches, please. But rather than use my prerogative as moderator and ask the first question, you get the first question. So let's go, and I see a hand up, and let's wait for the microphone. I'd also encourage students, don't be intimidated, ask your questions.
May I first apologize because my staff tells me that I have referred to Princeton, and I was drawn to the blizzard yet again. So Stanford.
That merger has not been announced yet.
Thank you so much for your wonderful comments today. My name is Natalie Fields. I'm the Executive Director of Accountability Council and a Sears Fellow here at FSI. My question is about accountability and governance and how it relates to the new multilateralism. Given that there's a real inequality growing not only among individuals but among governance, the more nation states you have, the fewer votes from the impoverished country based on quota into the IMF. This problem is exacerbated at the individual level as well, given the fact that the IMF is one of the last remaining multilaterals that has no accountability structure.
Short question now. What's the question?
So the question is, what is the proposal to bring the IMF in line with the rest of the multilaterals in terms of individual accountability offices so that individuals harmed by IMF policies or procedures can demand justice?
I would like to dissent in relation to accountability. And I know that together with other UN institutions, by the way, we have a special legal framework that operates in relation to individual accountability. We're not single in that respect. But the IMF is accountable and probably more so than many other institutions, simply because we are accountable to a board of 24 representatives of 188 member states. You know, I was in Kenya 4 weeks ago, and Kenya is going through a reorganization, putting in place a degree of devolution that will create 37, if I recall, different regions. And I went to the Nairobi Parliament, and I was asked by members of Parliament, you know, how can we access funding from the IMF? And I thought, well, wait a minute, funding from the IMF, this is a government. You know, governments can access funding because they are the members of the club. And we don't have, you know, subsets of the various countries likely to apply. So I explained that. I said, you know, we, the board, we, the staff, are accountable to 188 members, but not to each and every region or each and every state, if you take the United States, for instance. This is not in the articles of the IMF, and the articles are very, very solid rules of law, because we have to operate by the rule of law in order to protect the small states from the bigger states. So the next question I got was from that same person: how do we change the articles so that we can access funding? But that's just to, you know, address your point about accountability. Decisions that we make are made by the board of the IMF, and the board of the IMF represents the 188 member states. And, you know, staff proposals are intermediate between staff and the board, but the decisions are made by the board. So it's the international communities that decide to go and help Ireland, that decides to put in place a special program for Tunisia, that decides to do immediate and prompt technical assistance in such and such other country. That's how it works. That's the accountability that we have.
Question here, the guy with the red sweater, please.
I have the mic over here.
Get him a mic.
Ma'am, my name is Paul Lasser. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Business across the street.
You might have some French connections.
Yes. I come to this point right now. So most G20 policy makers are elected. So as you said, in France, for instance, for a French president, implement necessary measures often means this is very unpopular. And it can explain why in many democracies over the last 40 years, public deficits have steadily increased. So my question is simple. Do you think that democracy is one of the roots of the current economic issues in the world? And do you think that in these democracies, you need serious crises in order to change?
You're asking me what is the correlation between democracy and fiscal deficit? To really cut it really shortly and sharply?
What I meant is that if policymakers want to implement what the IMF advocates for,
Yeah.
it's often very to cut the deficit.
Yeah.
It's often very unpopular.
Yeah. No, okay, I'm with you. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that there is a correlation, actually. Because if you look at, there are countries, including with very stable governments, and even governments that were re-elected in spite of those policies, that have driven reform programs, that have driven sound fiscal policies without having anything to do other than the usual annual Article 4 review with the IMF. If you look at some of the Nordic countries of Europe, if you look at Germany lately, those reforms, the Haas reforms in Germany, for instance, have been conducted without the IMF having anything to do with it. There's one. I would agree with you that it requires courage, whether it's with or without the IMF, because to conduct fiscal consolidation policies, to implement structural reforms, requires determination and courage, and sometimes enough of a sense of risk that people are actually prepared to lose once they've made the decisions and implemented the hard measures. That's true.
Here in the front row. And we'll go over and get a student next.
Hi, my name's Roman. I'm just wondering, do you think the...
And who are you?
my name's Roman, and I'm a student here in public policy.
Okay. Public policy, okay.
Yeah, do you think the failure of the U.S. Congress to approve the quota reforms merits a reduction in the authority or power of the United States in the IMF, particularly by maybe eliminating the veto power that the U.S. essentially has?
My short answer is no. But my longer answer is, let us implement what has been agreed. So, if what has been agreed, what has been actually championed by the United States is implemented, there will be a better reallocation amongst the membership. Emerging countries will be better represented. The whole quota of the IMF will be increased and will make it more crisis resistant. And yet, under that change, the United States still has more than 15% and therefore still has its veto right. So I'm just saying, let's go by the rules. The IMF is a rule-based institution, should be so to protect the small ones from the bigger ones. There are rules, let's play by the rules.
Over here with the shirt sleeves rolled up. There you go.
Thank you, Madam Lagarde. My name is Mariano Otero. I'm a business school student from Argentina. In countries such as mine, the IMF lost a little bit of credibility through being linked to some policies that were not very good for the economy, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s. So my question to you is, what do you think is the role of the IMF in terms of engaging with the people in these countries where they are promoting policies to make sure that they got their support and that they gain legitimacy with these people who are so far away, so far removed from the decisions that the IMF makes?
Yeah, that's a very good point. One is, you have to know that we have two Argentinians on the board of the IMF, one who is the alternate of Brazil and the other one who is representing a group of the Latin American countries. So the Argentinian voices are well heard at the board. Number two, we are re-engaging, and I've made that point very clear ever since the beginning. We are re-engaging on CPI calculations. We are re-engaging on technical assistance in the financial markets. We have conducted a financial sector assessment a few months ago. So it's not as if the relationship is broken with Argentina, far from it. But there is a lot more work to do, and I hope we can continue doing it and we can pursue in that direction. To better engage, I think we need to explain what we do by way of prevention, by way of technical assistance, by way of services, support to the economy. We're not coming, with the nasty finger of the teacher who says, you haven't done the job right. Saying, there are many countries around the table and they've all gone by, difficult situations. We have a repository of all that. We have expertise and we can lend that to improve the situation. We were also determined to help Argentina in front of the Supreme Court of the United States in a very difficult case having to do with, as you know, the opt-outs of the collective action clauses in the debt restructuring project. So we want that relationship to flourish, but it's a give and take process, and we have to start with the right numbers.
Yes, right here in the fourth row.
My name is Alix Marduel, and I'm a doctor and specialize in sleep. And I'm not making fun of your accent. I'm also French. And my question is, I'm very interested in you being the next president of France. Are you? Are you? The question is, are you?
I thought you cared for my sleep.
Let the record show there was no comment. Yes, over here.
Right here, John.
Hi, Jason Bennett with KLIV News Radio. I was wondering if you could give us your analysis of the economic situation in the Ukraine and if you think it might pose a danger to its European neighbors' economies.
Okay, given that it's a question asked by a journalist and that there might be a few others in the room interested in the same topic, I'm going to be very succinct, but I will address your question because I don't, I'm not in the, I don't have the habit of trying to evade. The economic situation of the country is a difficult one. It's one that has evolved in the last few weeks a lot. We have constantly and consistently had a representative of the IMF on the ground. He will be very active in assessing the situation in the next few days. And we will probably shortly send some technical assistance support to the country because this is our duty to a member if that member asks for that. That is clearly what is likely to happen. Now, to go further, to support better this economy, we need to engage in a dialogue in which the Ukrainian authorities, once designated, will seek out the help and support of the IMF. That's the, in sequences, that's how it can work. But we are ready to engage. We have worked consistently over the years, not always successfully, but we have worked consistently with the various Ukrainian authorities, and Ukraine is a full-fledged member of the institution.
Right here in the center. Yeah. You, sir.
Got you right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a student here in computational and mathematical engineering. You mentioned that with the G20 in Sydney, we're coming to the end of a cycle of financial reforms starting back in London. But there seems to be a lot of skepticism around that. The headline in the Financial Times on Friday was saying that Dodd-Frank in the US will not prevent another crisis. So do you think we're coming to the end of a cycle or the cycle we wish we had?
I think it's a great question. I think we are, I'm a firm believer in setting objective, checking whether we've achieved something, completed, and moving on. And the objectives that were set out in 2009 in London included, financial reform by reinforcing the banks and particularly the systemically important institutions. That was going to deal with the derivative markets. That was going to deal with the too big to fail issues that we faced at the time. And that was going to also address the shadow banking. So I think on those four fronts, a lot has been done, whether it's through the Basel Committee, whether it's with the support of the FSB, or whether it's through our support as well. The various big domestic markets have moved, whether it's Dodd-Frank, whether it's Vickers in the UK, whether it's Liikanen in Europe. A lot of changes have taken place. And that agenda that was set be completed in 2014 is good. But it's not the end of the road. Because as we know, financial institutions, financial markets keep evolving as well. They move faster. They invent new circuits. They discover new channels. And one of their objectives is to identify the rewards and to protect against risks. Equally, the objective and the purpose of policymakers around the world is to protect taxpayers, to use a sort of a generic word, from the risks that these various institutions or non-disclosed institutions or alternative systems can actually present to their base. So, ongoing mission, but that part I hope is completed by the end of 2014.
One more question over here, maybe on the far edge.
Thank you for being here. My name is Mahesh and I'm an undergraduate studying economics. You spoke extensively about the impact of technology on the global economy. I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think some of the emerging cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, if any, the role that they would have to play in this hyper-connected global modern economy, and especially keeping in mind the fact that they defy conventional monetary policy altogether.
You know, I sort of feared that question, and I'll tell you why. Because it's a big challenge at the moment. And I think many people have difficulties putting their arms around it. And it's a really sort of glamorous, sexy, attractive new system. There's that virtuality about it, great. But, you know, a monetary system is invested with public good. It is public good. A financial, stable monetary system is public good. And to be protected as public good, in our view, and you know, we might be all wrong, but in our view, it has to be supervised and sufficiently regulated so that it is accountable to those that are the owners, the individual owners of public good. And at this point in time, I think Bitcoins is pretty much outside that perimeter of both supervision and regulation. And to that extent, it lends itself to funny transactions, which have led to, not all, but at least some members to currently be behind bars for having done some money laundering through the system. And I think that the clearing platform that was supposed to be opened a couple of days ago is not opened, and the page has been deleted. So it's all quite shaky and wobbly at the moment. I'm not ruling it out. I'm not saying this is bad, but I really think that because monetary system, whether actual, virtual, or otherwise, are the guardians of a public good that is the monetary system, there has to be a degree of supervision, accountability, and therefore regulation applying to them.
I think we need to call this to a close. I want to thank you, and you honored us by being here. I noticed the organizers appropriately had us distinguished. But thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you so much.